H1 10 years. 1 mountain. H2 then a stranger knocked and called my home a violation. H3 the whole cul-de-sac came out to watch. H4 I just poured my coffee and said nothing. H5 but something in my silence made her flinch. H6 because she didn't know what I used to do for a living. H7 or what was buried in the county records office. H8 by the end of that week, she wouldn't be the one giving orders. My name is Emma Whitfield. I'm 42. And for 10 years I built my cabin log by log on 40 acres at the edge of Pine Hollow Ridge, Montana, with nothing but a truck, a chainsaw, and a grief I didn't know how to put down anywhere else. My husband Daniel died overseas when I was 32. We'd bought this land together, dreaming of retiring here. I finished it alone, board by board, with our old dog Ranger at my heels, because finishing it felt like the only promise I had left to keep. The nearest development, Pine Hollow Ridge Estates, sits half a mile down the gravel road. 40-some houses circled around a clubhouse nobody uses and a pool that closes every September like clockwork. I've never lived inside its gates, and I never signed anything with its name on it. My parcel predates the subdivision by 3 decades. It was homesteaded by the Colson family in the 1970s, sold to Daniel and me in a private deal, and recorded at the county courthouse with a grandfather clause explicitly excluding it from any future association covenants. I didn't think much about the HOA those first years. I waved at joggers, dropped off honey from my hives at the mailbox cluster, and mostly kept to myself, hauling lumber up the ridge while the subdivision hummed along with its sprinklers and its manicured cul-de-sacs. Karen Ashford became HOA president the year I finished framing the roof. She introduced herself at the community mailboxes with a clipboard in one hand and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, already asking what improvements I had planned for my lot. I told her, politely, that I wasn't part of the association. She laughed like I'd made a joke, tapped the clipboard, and said, "Everyone up here follows the same standards. Honey, it keeps property values up for all of us." I let it go. It seemed harmless. Karen's reputation preceded her by then. Neighbors joked, half serious, about her measuring lawn heights with a ruler and sending pastel-colored warning notices for the wrong shade of shutters. People rolled their eyes, but they complied. Nobody wanted to be the next name on her list. Her closest ally was Denise Park, who ran the HOA newsletter and seemed to know everyone's business before they did. Denise would drop by with muffins and, somewhere between compliments, mention that Karen had noticed my gravel driveway wasn't the approved shade of tan. I kept building. Up that spring, angled to catch the ridge sun, wired myself after 2 online certification courses, because independence had become less a preference and more a discipline I owed to the life Daniel and I had planned. At the 4th of July potluck, which I attended because Denise insisted neighbors would love to meet me, Karen worked the crowd like a campaign stop, dropping phrases like covenant compliance and community standards, while glancing my way more than seemed accidental. A man named Rick Coulter showed up that day too, introduced as a family friend and developer, shaking hands a little too warmly. He asked me odd questions about my acreage, my well, my access road, questions that felt more like an appraisal than small talk. I didn't think about Rick again until months later. At the time, I chalked it up to nosy small-town curiosity, thanked him for the burger recommendation, and went home to keep chinking logs before the first frost hit the ridge. Karen's first welcome letter arrived in October, printed on HOA letterhead, listing acceptable roof colors, fence heights, and outdoor lighting rules, addressed to the Whitfield residence, Pine Hollow Ridge Estates. My parcel was never in Pine Hollow Ridge Estates. I filed it and forgot it. I called the county recorder's office out of caution, just to confirm nothing had changed. The clerk read my deed back to me. Grandfather clause intact. Parcel boundary unchanged since 1978. I hung up reassured, certain a polite conversation would clear up any confusion. Denise mentioned, almost as an aside over coffee, that Karen had been so stressed lately, something about big plans for the neighborhood's future and protecting everyone's investment. I asked what she meant. Denise just shrugged and changed the subject to her daughter's soccer schedule. By November my chimney was smoking steadily against the cold, and twice I noticed a car slow down at the tree line above my cabin, idling long enough to make ranger bark before continuing on toward the subdivision gate. I didn't think much of it then. Karen cornered me at the mailboxes again. This time with a laminated map she said showed updated HOA boundaries. My parcel was shaded the same blue as the rest of the subdivision. I told her the county had no record of any boundary change. She smiled and said, "Not yet." That phrase stuck with me longer than it should have. Not yet. Something was coming that I didn't. I mentioned it to my friend Tom, a retired JAG officer from my old unit, who told me to start keeping records of everything. I took his advice more out of habit than worry. Discipline had gotten me through worse than a homeowners association. I bought a small dashcam for the driveway and started saving copies of every letter Karen sent, filed neatly in a drawer beside Daniel's old photographs. Winter passed quietly enough. Karen still greeted me with that same too bright smile whenever our paths crossed, and I still assumed, foolishly, that this was simply the personality of a woman who liked control more than most, and that it would never really touch my life. Then, in early spring, a letter arrived that wasn't a welcome packet or a friendly reminder. It was a formal notice, HOA seal embossed at the top, citing my cabin's cedar shake roof as non-compliant with community aesthetic standards, demanding correction within 30 days. I read it twice, standing at my own mailbox on land that had never once belonged to Karen Ashford's association, and felt something shift, quiet and cold, the way it used to feel right before an operation went from routine to something else entirely. I drove straight to the county office with my deed in hand. The clerk pulled the plat map, traced the boundary line with her finger, and confirmed again, in writing this time, that my parcel had never been annexed into Pine Hollow Ridge Estates. I asked for a certified copy. Armed with that letter, I called Karen directly instead of writing back. She answered breezy and confident, told me the board had recently voted to formalize boundary language, and that paperwork was in process at the county. I told her the county had no record of that. She hung up. 2 days later, Denise showed up at my gate, visibly uncomfortable, saying Karen wanted to clear the air over coffee at the clubhouse. I went, mostly to see what Karen actually had, because bluffing was never something I'd learned to fear. Karen slid a folder across the table containing a resolution, supposedly passed by the HOA board extending the covenant to adjacent grandfathered parcels for uniformity.
No county stamp. No recording number. Just a signature block and a date that looked suspiciously fresh compared to the paper's age.
I asked to see the recorded version at the courthouse. Karen said it was still processing. I told her that until it was recorded, it meant nothing legally, and that my land remained exactly what my deed said it was. Her smile thinned but didn't break. She pivoted instead to my wood stove, claiming 3 separate complaints about smoke drifting toward the subdivision. Complaints she wouldn't name, from neighbors she wouldn't identify, insisting I install a costlier, HOA-approved model regardless of my parcel's actual status. That night, I checked my dashcam footage out of instinct and found nothing unusual. Just wind moving through pines. But I noticed the same silver sedan from November parked again at the tree line. Engine running. For nearly 20 minutes before pulling away toward the Coulter development sign on Route 9. At the next community meeting, which I attended uninvited but unchallenged, Karen stood at the podium and referenced certain individuals near the ridge who were resisting community standards, never naming me directly, but every head in the room turned my way anyway. A neighbor named Frank Delgado caught my eye afterward and quietly told me Karen had been pushing hard lately for something called a boundary harmonization initiative. Tied, he thought, to a resort proposal from Rick Coulter that needed the whole ridge under one association's control. That was the first thread that didn't feel like petty small-town politics. I thanked Frank and drove home turning the phrase, resort proposal over and over, remembering Rick's oddly specific questions about my well depth and access road at the 4th of July potluck. Karen's Facebook posts in the community group grew pointed that week. Vague enough to avoid naming me directly, but specific enough that everyone understood. Some residents think the rules don't apply to them, paired with a stock photo of a rundown cabin that wasn't mine. Comments piled up fast. Some defending me without knowing the full story. Others parroting Karen's language about protecting property values. I stayed off the thread entirely, choosing instead to organize my paperwork. Date. Plat map. County letters. Into one growing folder labeled simply Pine Hollow. My niece Jenna, a junior reporter at the regional paper, called that weekend just to check in. I mentioned the HOA trouble almost as a joke. She went quiet for a second and asked me to send her copies of everything Karen had sent. Reporters, turned out, loved a paper trail. Karen showed up unannounced the following Tuesday with a man in a polo shirt who introduced himself as a certified inspector, asking to walk my property to assess compliance. I told them both, calmly, that without HOA jurisdiction or my invitation, they were standing on private land. The man looked uncertain, glancing at Karen, who insisted the new resolution gave them authority. I repeated that the resolution wasn't recorded and asked them to leave. They did, eventually, but not before the inspector snapped photos of my solar panels and propane tank from the property line. I called Tom that evening, and he laughed grimly, said it sounded exactly like the kind of intimidation tactic HOAs used when they had no legal ground but plenty of social pressure. He told me to keep documenting, stay calm, and never, ever let them provoke a reaction on camera. A week later, Animal Control showed up at my gate over an anonymous complaint about Ranger being aggressive off-leash, despite the fact he hadn't left my fenced yard in months. The officer apologized, said the complaint had come from a concerned community member, and left without incident. I began to notice a pattern. Every escalation arrived exactly when I'd pushed back on a piece of paperwork. It wasn't random harassment. It was retaliation, timed and deliberate, and it was starting to look less like busybody nagging and more like a campaign with a purpose. Denise called me privately that week, voice hushed, saying only that Karen had been different lately, distracted, short-tempered, taking calls behind closed doors from someone she referred to only as the investor. Denise wouldn't say more, but she sounded scared for the first time. I thanked her and didn't press. Whatever was happening behind Karen's carefully managed image, I wasn't going to get the whole truth from a nervous phone call. I went back to my folder, added the Animal Control report, and kept building my case one document at a time. By the time the mountain's first real heat wave hit in June, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit. This wasn't about roof shingles or smoke complaints anymore. Someone wanted my land, and Karen Ashford had decided she was the one who was going to get it for them. The fines started that June. Official-looking invoices from Pine Hollow Ridge Estates HOA, citing daily penalties for unresolved violations, despite my parcel never legally belonging to the association. I mailed each one back marked, "Not a member," disputed, and kept certified copies of every reply. Karen escalated to threatening a lien on my property if compliance issues persist. Language lifted almost verbatim from the subdivision's actual covenant, as though she assumed I'd never bother reading the document closely enough to notice it didn't apply to parcels like mine at all. I drove to the county attorney's office with my folder, now 3 inches thick. The paralegal who reviewed it whistled low and told me plainly that any lien filed against an unincorporated parcel outside the HOA's recorded boundary would be void on its face, and possibly actionable as harassment. Armed with that, I sent Karen a formal letter, copying the HOA's own board members, stating clearly that further fines or liens against my property would be treated as fraudulent filings and reported accordingly. For 2 weeks after that, everything went quiet. I should have known better. The quiet broke on a Tuesday morning when I found survey stakes driven into my own tree line, 40 yards inside my fence. Orange flags fluttering where no surveyor had ever asked my permission to set foot. My dashcam caught 2 men in county-looking vests placing them at dawn. I called the county surveyor's office directly, and they confirmed no permit had been issued for any survey work on my parcel. Whoever placed those stakes had done so without authorization, on private property, which technically constituted trespassing, and I made sure that word appeared in my written complaint. Karen denied any knowledge when I confronted her, insisting she'd simply asked a friend in the business to look into boundary questions as a favor to the board. I asked for his name. She never did. That same week, a 1-star review appeared on a random local business page I'd once posted about, written under a name I didn't recognize, describing me as hostile and not a team player in the community. Small, petty, but pointed, the kind of thing only someone paying close attention would bother writing. I mentioned the review to Jenna during our weekly call. She'd already started quietly pulling public records on Karen Ashford, HOA filings, board meeting minutes, and, almost as an afterthought, a business registration for something called Ridge Vista Development, filed 6 months earlier with Rick Coulter listed as managing partner. Karen Ashford's name wasn't on that filing, but her husband's was listed as a silent partner with a 10% stake, dated 3 weeks before the very first welcome letter ever arrived at my mailbox. Jenna read me the filing number twice, just to be sure I'd heard it right. I sat with that information for a long time that night, staring at the ridgeline where Daniel and I had once stood picking the exact spot for our cabin, and understood, finally, that none of this had ever been about shingles or smoke. It was about the view and the acreage. A sheriff's deputy stopped by 2 days later, polite but firm, responding to a complaint that I'd confronted and intimidated HOA contractors on my property. I showed him the dashcam footage, myself calmly asking the surveyors to leave. He watched it twice, apologized, and left without filing anything. Karen's version of events had already spread through the neighborhood group by the time he left, framed as me chasing off workers with aggressive behavior. A story so far from the calm, clipped tone on my own footage that I almost laughed, if it hadn't been so clearly deliberate. Frank Delgado texted me that night, quietly on my side now, saying half the cul-de-sac was starting to whisper that Karen's version didn't add up, that people had seen my dashcam clip when I finally posted it in response. Calm voice against her theatrical retelling. Denise stopped answering my calls for a while after that. Caught, I assumed, between loyalty to Karen and a growing discomfort with what she was being asked to go along with. I didn't blame her. Relationships, and I understood the cost of picking a side too early. I called Tom again, laid out everything, the survey stakes, the LLC filing, the fake review, the deputy's visit. He went quiet on the line for a moment and then said, in that flat, careful voice I remembered from briefings before difficult missions, Emma, document faster than they can move. I took his advice literally. I bought a second camera for the tree line, backed up every file to 3 separate drives, and began keeping a written log, time-stamped, of every incident, every phone call, every strange car idling on the ridge road above my property line. Karen tried a different tactic that week, showing up alone this time, without Denise or the inspector, standing at my gate with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, something closer to desperation than authority. We could still fix this quietly, she said. Before it gets worse for you. I asked her what worse meant. She didn't answer directly, just repeated that the board had plans for the ridge and that it would be so much easier if I simply sold my parcel to someone who could develop it properly. It was the first time she'd said the quiet part almost out loud. I told her my land wasn't for sale, that it never had been, and that Daniel and I had built our future on that exact hillside long before her HOA existed. She looked at me for a long moment, something flickering behind her eyes, and said quietly, everyone has a price eventually. That line stayed with me longer than any fine or fake resolution had. It wasn't the words of a rule-obsessed busybody anymore. It was the language of someone under pressure from people far more interested in profit than lawn heights. And I finally understood how far she might be willing to go. I called the county attorney's office again, this time asking specifically about protections against coordinated harassment tied to a real estate transaction. The attorney I spoke with, a calm woman named Priscilla Reyes, told me to keep documenting and offered to review my file personally once it was complete. Jenna's digging deep in that week. She found permit applications filed by Ridge Vista Development for a boutique resort and conference center. Maps attached showing a footprint that swallowed not just the old clubhouse lot, but a long stretch of ridgeland that included, unmistakably, my 40 acres. Seeing my own land outlined in someone else's blueprint knocked the wind out of me in a way none of Karen's letters ever had. It wasn't abstract anymore. Somewhere in an office downtown, men in polo shirts had already drawn my cabin's footprint out of existence on a glossy rendering. I printed that permit application and pinned it above my desk beside a photo of Daniel standing at the exact spot where the rendering showed a proposed infinity pool. I didn't cry in the early years. What I felt now was something steadier, colder, more useful. Karen's next move arrived by certified mail. An official-looking notice of intent to foreclose lien from a name I didn't recognize. LLC registered, claiming unpaid HOA assessments totaling nearly $11,000. I photographed every page and drove it straight to Priscilla's office the following morning. Priscilla read it once, then again, and told me flatly that the filing was almost certainly fraudulent, since no valid lien could exist against a parcel outside recorded HOA jurisdiction, and that pursuing foreclosure on that basis could expose whoever filed it to serious civil and possibly criminal liability. She helped me draft a formal cease and desist, copied to the county recorder, the HOA board, and, at her suggestion, the state's real estate licensing board, given Rick Coulter's name attached to the LLC behind the filing. For the first time in months, I felt the ground shift back under me. I mailed it certified, return receipt requested, and waited. 3 days later, the phony foreclosure notice was quietly withdrawn. No explanation, no apology, just a single line stating the matter had been resolved administratively. Karen, notably, Went silent on the neighborhood Facebook page for the first time in weeks. Frank told me the whispers around the cul-de-sac had shifted again. People asking openly now why Karen was fighting so hard over a piece of land she had no legal claim to, and why a development company nobody had heard of kept showing up in conversations about the Ridge project. I should have felt satisfied. Instead, I felt the particular unease I remembered from deployments, the quiet before an enemy regrouped rather than retreated. Karen wasn't beaten. She was recalculating. And somewhere in that recalculation, I suspected she was about to stop playing by even the rules she'd invented. For nearly 3 weeks after the withdrawn lien, an uneasy calm settled over the ridge. No letters arrived. No strange cars idled at the tree line. And Karen's neighborhood posts turned suspiciously cheerful, full of pool schedules and upcoming bake sales instead of veiled warnings about compliance. Then, unexpectedly, an invitation appeared in my mailbox, handwritten instead of printed, asking me to a small neighbor's barbecue at Karen's house that Saturday. Signed simply, "Let's put this behind us. Karen." Jenna told me to go. "See what she wants," she said.
"People show their hand."
I arrived cautious but composed. Ranger left at home. Dashcam recording quietly in my parked truck just in case. Karen greeted me at the door with a smile that looked, for once, almost genuine, and introduced me around her patio as though the last 6 months had never happened. Her husband, Paul, a quiet accountant type, seemed uncomfortable the entire evening, refilling drinks a little too quickly, avoiding eye contact whenever Karen's development friends were mentioned. At one point he told me quietly, almost apologetically, "She's under a lot of pressure right now. More than people know." I asked what kind of pressure. He hesitated, then mentioned, vaguely, refinancing trouble on their house. A big opportunity tied to the Ridge project that Karen had already committed to before fully thinking it through. He caught himself mid-sentence and changed the subject to the grilled corn. Karen pulled me aside near the end of the evening, wine glass in hand, and said something that surprised me. "I know this got out of hand. I didn't want it to go this far." For a moment, standing in her string-lit backyard, she almost sounded like an ordinary, tired woman. I told her, honestly, that I'd be glad for it to end, that I never wanted a fight, only to be left alone on land that was legally mine. She nodded slowly, looked toward the ridge line glowing pink in the sunset, and said, "It's beautiful up there. I understand why you fought for it." Driving home that night, I let myself believe, briefly, that something had shifted, that exhaustion or conscience had finally caught up with her. I even mentioned to Jenna that maybe the worst was over. She was quieter on the phone than usual, and simply said, "Maybe. Keep your cameras on anyway." A few days later, Denise called again, warmer than she'd been in weeks, inviting me to help organize the fall potluck committee. A small gesture that felt like an olive branch from the whole neighborhood, not just Karen. I said yes, cautiously hopeful, grateful for the normalcy of it. I spent that week finishing the cabin's front porch railing, the last major project on my original 10-year plan, sanding cedar in the evening sun with Ranger asleep beside me, allowing myself, for the first time in a long while, to simply enjoy the home I'd built without watching the tree line. Even Priscilla noted the shift when I called for an update, saying the state licensing board inquiry into Rick Coulter's LLC was moving slowly but existed on record now, a paper trail that couldn't easily disappear. "Sometimes," she said, "the quiet part just means they're regrouping somewhere you can't see." I should have paid closer attention to that warning. Instead, I let the calm settle into me the way exhaustion settles into a body after a long deployment home, mistaking the absence of gunfire for the absence of danger, when really it only ever meant the next move hadn't been made yet. What I didn't know, sitting on my new porch railing that quiet week, was that the barbecue hadn't been an apology at all. It had been reconnaissance, Karen gathering exactly what she needed, my routines, my trust, and one careless mention of an old mining survey I'd found in the county archive. The mining survey came up almost by accident that evening on Karen's patio. Me mentioning, in passing conversation, an old 1930s mineral rights document I'd stumbled across while researching my parcel's history. Curious but ultimately irrelevant since surface rights had always remained fully mine under the original deed. I hadn't thought about that comment again until Jenna called, tense, saying Karen had requested an emergency HOA board meeting for the following week. Agenda item vague, boundary and access clarification, ridge parcel. My stomach dropped. Whatever Karen was planning, my own words had apparently handed her a new angle. I attended that meeting, uninvited but unchallenged as always, and watched Karen present a historical document claiming a legacy mining access easement crossed directly through my cabin's footprint, granting the association a right-of-way for maintenance and safety inspections, regardless of my parcel's grandfathered status. The document looked convincing at a glance. Aged paper, official-looking seal, but something about the font in the header struck me as wrong. Too modern for a supposed 1930s filing. I asked to see the original recording number. Karen said it was still being located at the county archive. Priscilla, whom I'd asked to attend as an observer, leaned over and whispered that legitimate historical easements didn't simply appear without a recorded instrument number, and that presenting an unverified document to a public board as established fact could constitute a serious misrepresentation, especially if used to justify further action. The board, mostly Karen's longtime allies, voted anyway to formally request compliance with the supposed easement, giving me 30 days to allow inspection access to my land. I stood and calmly stated, for the record, that I would not grant access without a verified, recorded county instrument. Karen's smile faltered for the first time that whole meeting, replaced by something sharper. "We'll pursue this through appropriate channels then," she said, voice tight. I recognized that tone. It wasn't defeat, lightly for an audience that still, mostly, trusted her. Jenna filed a public records request that same week for the supposed 1930s mining easement, and the county archivist responded within days. No such instrument existed in any recorded index, historical or current. Whatever Karen had presented to the board had been fabricated, and fabricated recently at that. I sent that finding to Priscilla immediately, and she began drafting a formal complaint to the county, alleging presentation of a fraudulent document to a quasi-governmental board meeting. It wasn't a criminal filing yet, she cautioned, but it built a documented pattern that would matter enormously if this ever escalated further. Karen, undeterred by the archivist's response, pivoted publicly, telling the neighborhood group that the county was slow to update old records, and that the board stood by its findings regardless. Comments split sharply now, longtime residents starting to question, openly, why she was pushing so hard on a stranger's land. A lawyer named Gordon Fields appeared at the next meeting, introduced by Karen as a friend of the family, offering the HOA pro bono guidance. Though Jenna quickly discovered Gordon's firm had represented Ridge Vista Development in 2 prior permitting disputes, a connection Karen never disclosed to the board. Gordon sent me a formal letter threatening legal action if I continued obstructing the HOA's historical access rights, language crafted to sound official despite resting entirely on a document the county had already confirmed didn't exist. I forwarded it directly to Priscilla and didn't bother responding to Gordon myself. That same week, my internet cooperative sent a notice that my membership was under review following a complaint about unauthorized commercial use. Despite the fact I ran nothing but a small home office and my beehive supply shop, both fully within the co-op's residential terms of service. The co-op's local board chair, turned out, was a woman named Sheila Vance, a close friend of Karen's from church, a connection I only learned because Frank happened to mention it while helping me split firewood, shaking his head at how tangled the small-town web of favors truly ran. I called the co-op directly, calm but firm, and requested the specific complaint in writing along with the reviewer's name. They couldn't produce either, and within 2 days my membership review was quietly closed. No violation found, though the harassment of it had cost me an anxious, sleepless week regardless. Karen's public tone shifted again after that, softer in her posts, framing herself as a concerned volunteer, simply trying to protect the community from an outsider who refused to cooperate, a narrative that still landed with newer residents who hadn't watched the last year unfold up close like Frank and Denise had. Denise, for her part, grew quieter at every meeting, rarely speaking, her earlier warmth toward me carefully hidden whenever Karen was nearby. I caught her eye once across the clubhouse parking lot, and for just a second, something like guilt passed over her face before she looked away and got in her car. Jenna's editor greenlit a preliminary story that week, cautious but pointed, examining the pattern of a homeowners association pursuing action against a parcel outside its recorded jurisdiction, timed suspiciously alongside a nearby resort development filing. It wouldn't publish yet, Jenna said, but the pieces were finally assembling into something undeniable. Rick Coulter himself called me directly for the first time, voice smooth, offering what he called a generous relocation package, nearly double my land's assessed value, framed as a neighborly solution to what he called unfortunate boundary confusion. I told him my land had never been confused about anything. He laughed, a little too easily, and said something that stuck with me. Everyone up on that ridge eventually sees reason. Mrs. Whitfield. Smooth we make the road. I told him my road wasn't for sale either, and hung up before he could answer. That call confirmed what Jenna's research had already suggested. This was never really Karen's crusade alone. She was the visible edge of something larger, a resort deal that needed my parcel specifically, and she'd apparently decided my land was worth risking her own reputation, and possibly her legal standing, to obtain. I called Tom that night and told him everything. The fake easement, the co-op complaint, Rick's call. He was quiet for a long moment before saying, in that old briefing voice, Emma, they're not just harassing you anymore. They're running out of legal options, which means they'll start improvising. His warning proved right within days. I woke one morning to find the shared gravel access gate, the one connecting my private road to the county easement, chained shut with a combination lock and a laminated HOA sign reading, Private Association Road, authorized vehicles only. I checked my deed again, though I already knew the answer. That access road had an explicit recorded easement in my favor, older than the HOA itself, guaranteeing right of passage regardless of association membership. I called Priscilla immediately, photos attached, and she said flatly, that's obstruction. Call the sheriff too. A deputy arrived within the hour, reviewed my recorded easement documents, and personally cut the chain himself, noting in his report that obstructing a legally recorded access easement could constitute a criminal offense. He left a copy of the citation taped to Karen's own mailbox. Per department procedure. Karen's response, when Frank told me about it later, was to claim the gate had been installed by an overzealous contractor without her knowledge, though the HOA newsletter distributed the week before had explicitly announced new access controls for community safety under her own signature block. Jenna's editor moved the story timeline up after the gate incident, calling it a turning point too significant to sit on. She began finalizing interviews, reaching out to the county planning office, to Priscilla, and, cautiously, to Karen herself for comment, giving her the standard chance to respond before publication. Karen didn't respond to Jenna's request. Instead, according to Denise, who finally broke her silence to me in a tense, hushed phone call, Karen spent that entire week locked in her home office on calls with Rick Coulter and Gordon Fields, voice raised loud enough to carry through the walls. Denise told me, almost in a whisper, that she'd overheard Karen say, "If she won't sell, we make it too expensive for her to stay." I asked Denise if she was willing to say that on the record. There was a long pause before she said, quietly, "Let me think about it." I didn't push her. Better than most. What it cost to stand against someone you'd spent years being loyal to, even when that loyalty had curdled into something you no longer recognized. I thanked her for calling and told her the door would stay open whenever she was ready. Meanwhile, my legal file with Priscilla had grown thick enough to require its own binder. Fraudulent liens, a fabricated easement, an obstructed road, a bad faith co-op complaint, all time-stamped, all cross-referenced, all building toward a pattern too consistent to explain away as simple neighborhood misunderstanding anymore. Priscilla suggested I request a formal hearing before the County Board of Commissioners regarding the HOA's repeated claims of jurisdiction over my parcel.
A public forum that would put everything on record at once, forcing Karen to defend her actions in front of officials, rather than a friendly neighborhood crowd.
I agreed, and Priscilla filed the request that week, scheduling a hearing for early September, just under a month away. Word of the filing spread fast through the neighborhood group, and for the first time, the tone of the comments shifted decisively away from Karen's version of events. Karen's response was to schedule her own emergency board meeting 3 days before the county hearing. Agenda listed simply as Ridge Parcel Resolution, Final Vote. An obvious attempt to lock in some kind of internal HOA decision before outside officials could examine the situation with fresh, unbiased eyes. Frank warned me the emergency meeting was being framed, quietly, among Karen's inner circle, as a vote to formally annex my parcel through some obscure clause. In the original covenant regarding adjacent unincorporated properties, a legal theory Priscilla called, bluntly, a fantasy with no basis in state law. I spent that stretch of August preparing methodically, the way I once prepared before deployments, organizing every document chronologically, drafting a comm statement for the county hearing, and reviewing dashcam footage with Priscilla to select the clearest examples of trespass, fraud, and obstruction for the record. Jenna's article finally published that third week of August. Careful and measured, laying out the fabricated easement, the withdrawn fraudulent lien, the obstructed access road, and Ridge Vista Development's overlapping permit application, without yet naming Karen's husband's financial stake, which Jenna was saving for a planned follow-up piece. The article spread through the small town faster than anything I'd seen since moving there, shared in every local group, discussed at the diner, at the hardware store, at the gas station where the clerk asked me, half joking, if I was the cabin lady from the article. I told her I was. Karen's public image cracked visibly for the first time. Longtime allies grew noticeably quieter online, some outright apologizing to me in private messages, admitting they trusted her account without ever hearing mine. It wasn't vindication yet, but it was, finally, the ground beginning to shift beneath her instead of me. Gordon Fields sent a cease and desist to Jenna's newspaper, threatening defamation action over the article, though Priscilla reviewed it and noted, dryly, that every claim in the piece was sourced directly from public records and sworn statements, making any defamation suit almost certainly unwinnable, and likely just another bluff. Rick Coulter went unusually silent that week. No calls, no more generous offers, and Jenna discovered his development firm had quietly requested a 60-day extension on their resort permit application. Language in the request citing unresolved title complications on a key parcel, which Priscilla read aloud with a small, satisfied smile. Karen held her emergency meeting anyway, 3 days before the county hearing as planned, and according to Frank, who attended and texted me updates in real time, the room was tense. Half the attendees openly skeptical, asking pointed questions about the fabricated easement the article had exposed days earlier. The board, rattled, tabled the annexation vote instead of passing it, citing a need for further legal review, a quiet, humiliating retreat that Karen tried to frame as due diligence, but that everyone in that room, Frank said, understood for exactly what it was, the first real crack in her authority. Denise called me that same night, voice steadier than it had been in weeks, and told me she was ready to speak on the record for Jenna's follow-up piece. And, if it came to it, at the county hearing itself. I'm done protecting something that was never really about the community, she said. I thanked her, genuinely, understanding what that decision would cost her socially in a town this small. She said only, you kept your head up through all of this. Made it easier to admit I should have said something sooner. I told her it wasn't too late. It rarely is, in my experience, with the hearing now less than a week away. Karen's desperation showed itself in smaller, sharper ways. A terse email demanding I remove Jenna's article link from the neighborhood group. A call from Gordon threatening vague consequences if I continued this smear campaign against a dedicated community volunteer. I didn't respond to either. Priscilla had one piece of advice heading into that final stretch. The same advice Tom had given me at the very start. Document everything, react to nothing, and let the truth, fully assembled now across 2 folders, 1 binder, and a published article, speak for itself. 4 days before the county hearing, I woke before dawn to Ranger barking wildly at the tree line, and found, in my dashcam footage, 2 figures moving through the dark near my propane tank, flashlights sweeping low, retreating quickly toward a car idling with its lights off near the gate. I called the sheriff's department immediately. A deputy arrived within 20 minutes, examined the footage, and noted scuff marks near the propane valve consistent with tampering, though nothing had been damaged. He called it in as attempted vandalism and promised increased patrols along the Ridge Road for the coming week. Priscilla's reaction, when I called her that morning, was uncharacteristically sharp. This isn't code enforcement anymore, she said. This is someone panicking and getting reckless. I want everything documented, and I want you staying somewhere else at night until after that hearing. If you can manage it. I stayed. Of course. 10 years of building that cabin alone had taught me plenty about fear, mostly that running from it rarely solved anything real. Instead, I installed motion-triggered floodlights along the tree line and told Tom, who insisted on driving up from 2 states away, just to keep an eye on things. 2 days later, an anonymous note appeared tucked beneath my windshield wiper. Block letters cut from a magazine. Reading simply, "Sell before the hearing or regret it." I photographed it carefully without touching it further and handed it directly to the deputy assigned to my case, who logged it as evidence. Jenna's follow-up piece, running the day before the note appeared, finally named Karen's husband Paul's financial stake in Ridge Vista Development, alongside Denise's on-record statement about overheard threats and Karen's forged historical document. The town's mood shifted from curiosity to something closer to outrage on my behalf. Karen's response to the article was, according to Frank, near hysterical, calling an unscheduled visit to Denise's home that ended, neighbors reported, with raised voices audible through an open window and Denise's teenage daughter recording part of it on her phone before Karen abruptly left. That video, brief and shaky, showed Karen telling Denise, "You've ruined everything I've built here," a line that, once posted, spread through the neighborhood group faster than anything before it, striking most residents not as the words of a wronged community leader, but of someone unraveling under pressure. Gordon Fields resigned as HOA legal counsel 2 days later, citing, in a terse email obtained by Jenna, irreconcilable concerns regarding recent board actions, a quiet but unmistakable signal that even Karen's own hired lawyer had begun distancing himself from whatever she was planning next. Rick Coulter's development firm issued a brief public statement denying any improper conduct and claiming they had no direct involvement in HOA matters.
Despite Jenna's documentation of Paul Ashford's ownership stake and the resort footprint map that included my property line drawn in unmistakable detail.
With the county hearing now 2 days out, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize, a man introducing himself as Commissioner Mike Alvarez, saying he wanted to speak with me personally before the hearing. When he mentioned he'd served with the 82nd, something in my chest went still. Mike had known Daniel, briefly, years before I met him, crossing paths during a joint training exercise long before either of us had ever heard of Pine Hollow Ridge. He told me he'd read Jenna's articles and reviewed the county filings himself, and simply wanted me to know he'd be listening closely. I thanked him, careful not to expect anything more than fairness, though the coincidence steadied me in a way I hadn't expected. Whatever happened at that hearing, at least one person on that commission would understand exactly what kind of discipline had built the cabin now sitting at the center of it all. The night before the hearing, Karen posted one final message to the neighborhood group, longer than her usual updates, framing herself as a devoted volunteer under attack by outside media and ungrateful residents, insisting the county hearing would set the record straight in her favor. Few comments followed. Fewer still supportive. I barely slept that night, not from fear exactly, but from the particular alertness I remembered before difficult missions, going over the file one final time with Priscilla on speakerphone, confirming every document, every timestamp, every piece of the story I intended to lay out plainly, without exaggeration. In the morning, Tom sat with me on the porch past midnight, Ranger between us, and told me something I hadn't expected to hear from him. "You've already won this," he said. "Not because of the hearing. Because you never once let her turn you into someone you're not." I held on to that longer than I admitted, Karen. Meanwhile, according to a text from Frank, who lived 2 houses down from her, hadn't turned her lights off until nearly 3 in the morning. Paul's car gone from the driveway entirely, a small, telling detail that suggested whatever partnership had built this scheme was already starting to fracture from within. I woke early, dressed simply, and drove to the county building with my binder, my flash drives, and a folder of photographs beside me on the passenger seat. Ranger left safely at home with Frank's teenage son watching over him. The same porch railing I'd sanded weeks earlier now finally, fully finished. The hearing room filled faster than I expected. Neighbors, reporters including Jenna seated with a notepad in the front row. Priscilla beside me at the small table reserved for parties to the matter. And Commissioner Mike Alvarez seated at the dais alongside two other commissioners I didn't recognize by name. Karen arrived with Gordon Fields, despite his resignation days earlier, apparently persuaded back for the hearing itself. And Rick Coulter sat 2 rows behind them, silent, arms crossed, looking noticeably less confident than he had over the phone weeks before, promising me a smooth road that had gone anything but smooth. The hearing opened with the county planning director summarizing the dispute plainly for the record. An association claiming jurisdiction over a parcel with a
recorded grandfather clause, a fabricated historical easement, a withdrawn fraudulent lien, and an obstructed access road. Each item met with murmurs from the gallery.
Karen was given the floor first, and she stood, composed at the outset, insisting the HOA had always acted in good faith to protect community standards, dismissing the mining easement as an honest historical misunderstanding, and framing the access gate as a necessary safety measure, unrelated to me personally. Commissioner Alvarez asked her directly, without hostility but without softness either, to explain the recorded date discrepancy on the mining easement document. The fact that its typeface and paper stock postdated its claimed 1930s origin by decades. Karen hesitated, said she'd have to check with the person who provided it. And who was that? Alvarez asked. Karen glanced, just briefly, toward Rick Coulter before answering that it had come from archival research the board commissioned. Though she couldn't immediately name the researcher, the firm, or produce any invoice for the work when pressed by the second commissioner. I was called next, and I spoke plainly, the way Tom had taught me years ago in briefings that mattered, laying out my deed, the county's confirmation letters, the certified surveyor's boundary report, and, quietly, the pattern of escalation, fines, fake liens, trespass, an obstructed easement, an anonymous threatening note. I placed the note on the table in a clear evidence bag, alongside the deputy's incident report, and said simply, I've spent 10 years building a home on land that has always, legally, been mine. I've never asked for anything from this association except to be left alone on it. Denise spoke after me, visibly nervous but steady, describing the overheard threat. Make it too expensive for her to stay, and confirming Karen had asked her, weeks earlier, to help gather personal information about my routines under the guise of community outreach ahead of what Denise now understood had been the barbecue. The room went noticeably still at that. Several longtime residents exchanging glances, the barbecue's true purpose landing with an audience that had, until that moment, mostly viewed it as a kind neighborly gesture rather than what it apparently had been all along. Reconnaissance dressed up as reconciliation. Gordon attempted to object, calling Denise's account hearsay and speculation, but Commissioner Alvarez reminded him, evenly, that this was a fact-finding hearing, not a courtroom, and that Denise's first-hand account, corroborated by her own text messages with Karen, was entirely relevant to the board's understanding of intent. Jenna, seated in the gallery, quietly passed Priscilla a printed copy of the State Real Estate Licensing Board's preliminary inquiry into Rick Coulter's LLC, opened just weeks earlier following the fraudulent lien filing. Timing that suggested this hearing wasn't Karen's first brush with official scrutiny, just the most public one yet. Priscilla entered it into the record, and Rick Coulter, still silent in his seat, shifted visibly, arms uncrossing, jaw tightening. The confident developer from that phone call weeks earlier nowhere in evidence now, replaced by a man clearly recalculating just how exposed his firm had become in front of county officials. Karen tried once more to regain control of the narrative. Standing abruptly, voice rising for the first time that morning, insisting the entire hearing was a coordinated smear, that I had always resisted community standards, that Denise was confused and manipulated by outside media into misremembering a private conversation. Commissioner Alvarez asked her, calmly but pointedly, to explain then why the HOA's own board had tabled the annexation vote days earlier, and why the association's legal counsel had resigned that same week. Karen opened her mouth, closed it, and for the first time all morning, had no ready answer prepared. In that silence, something in the room shifted, palpable, the way pressure drops before a storm finally breaks. I watched Karen's composure, so carefully constructed over months of laminated maps and confident smiles, begin to crack visibly under the simple weight of questions she could no longer spin her way around. A short recess was called before final statements, and in the hallway, Rick Coulter approached me alone, voice low, no longer smooth at all. "This didn't have to go this way," he said. I told him it never had to go this way in the first place, and walked back inside without waiting for a reply. Karen remained in the hallway alone during that recess, Paul notably absent from the entire hearing, Gordon speaking to her in hushed, clipped tones before gathering his briefcase and leaving the building entirely before the session resumed. A small but unmistakable sign of exactly how this was about to end. When the hearing resumed, Commissioner Alvarez asked whether either side had anything further to add before deliberation. Karen, alone now at her table, said quietly that she'd like to clarify her intentions, though her voice had lost the confident polish it carried at the start of the morning entirely. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said, echoing almost word for word what she'd told me on her patio weeks earlier, except this time the room heard it not as an apology, but as the first crack in a story that had never quite added up from the beginning. I said little in response, letting the document speak instead, the way Priscilla had coached me to. My statement was simple. I asked only that the county formally affirm my parcel's grandfathered status, dismiss all HOA claims of jurisdiction, and refer the fabricated documents for appropriate investigation. Priscilla submitted our final exhibit, a certified surveyor's report confirming, beyond any dispute, that my parcel's boundary matched the original 1978 recording exactly, with zero overlap into any land the HOA covenant had ever legitimately governed, closing the door on any lingering ambiguity about jurisdiction entirely. The commissioners retired briefly to confer, leaving the room in a tense, murmuring quiet. Frank caught my eye from the gallery and gave a small, steady nod. Jenna's pen hadn't stopped moving the entire hearing, and Denise sat with her hands folded tightly, watching Karen rather than the empty dais. Karen stared straight ahead during the recess, posture rigid, the laminated maps and confident clipboard of a year earlier nowhere in sight now. Just a woman sitting alone at a folding table while the community she'd spent years positioning herself above watched her wait for a verdict she'd clearly stopped controlling. I thought, watching her, not of anger exactly, but of Paul's absence, of the refinancing trouble he'd mentioned at the barbecue, of Denise's description of a woman under more pressure than people know. It didn't excuse anything, but it explained, quietly, how someone arrives at forging a document out of desperation. The commissioners returned after 20 minutes, and Alvarez read the preliminary findings aloud, careful and measured, The parcel's grandfathered status confirmed. All HOA claims of jurisdiction dismissed as without legal basis. The mining easement referred formally for investigation as a potentially fraudulent document presented to a public board. He continued, noting the county would refer the matter of the withdrawn lien and the obstructed easement to the district attorney's office for review, given the documented pattern, and that the state real estate board's existing inquiry into Ridge Vista development would receive the hearing's full record as supporting evidence. A quiet exhale moved through the gallery. Not celebration exactly, but relief. The particular relief of watching a slow, grinding injustice finally meet daylight. After months of laminated maps, fake letterhead, and confident smiles that had, for too long, gone unchallenged by anyone with the authority to say otherwise. Karen didn't move for a long moment after the findings were read, staring at the folder in front of her, the same kind of folder she'd once slid across. A clubhouse table full of fabricated resolutions, now empty of anything that could undo what had just been entered permanently into the county record. Rick Coulter left before the session officially closed, not waiting for questions from the small cluster of reporters gathering near the exit, and Jenna later confirmed. His firm's permit extension request had been quietly withdrawn entirely within 48 hours. The resort proposal effectively dead before it had ever broken ground. I stood outside the county building afterward, Priscilla beside me, Tom waiting by the truck with Ranger, who'd been dropped off by Frank's son just in time to greet me with the kind of unrestrained joy only a dog offers after a morning spent somewhere he clearly sensed had mattered. Denise approached hesitantly as the crowd thinned, apologizing quietly for how long it had taken her to speak up. I told her, honestly, that it mattered more that she'd done it at all than exactly when, and that I hoped whatever came next for her didn't cost as much as she feared. Frank shook my hand firmly, said something about how the whole cul-de-sac owed me an apology for ever believing Karen's version of events without question. And I told him most people just believe whoever speaks loudest first, until someone finally sits down and does the slow work of proving otherwise. Jenna hugged me outside the courthouse steps, notebook still in hand, already drafting the next morning's headline in her head. She admitted, something about grandfathered land and a resort deal that had underestimated exactly who it was trying to push off her own mountain. That evening, back on my porch with Tom and Ranger, the ridge glowing gold in the late summer light, I finally let myself feel something closer to relief than vigilance for the first time in over a year. The tension I'd carried since that first laminated map slowly, finally, beginning to loosen. Word moved through Pine Hollow Ridge Estates fast over the following days. The hearing's outcome dissected at the mailbox cluster, at the clubhouse, in every corner of the neighborhood group Karen had once used so effectively to shape opinion in her favor, now turning steadily, decisively, against her instead. The HOA board called an emergency session of its own that week. This one legitimate, to address what one board member's post called a serious breach of trust and possibly the law by their own sitting president. A meeting Karen reportedly did not attend, citing personal matters through a brief statement. Priscilla told me the district attorney's office had formally opened a file on the fabricated mining easement and the fraudulent lien, cautioning it could take months to resolve, but confirming the documentation I'd kept, methodically, from that very first suspicious letterhead, had made the case unusually easy to build. I visited the small stone marker I'd placed years earlier near the cabin's foundation, engraved simply with Daniel's name and the dates of a life that had ended too soon, and told him, quietly, the way I sometimes still did, that the mountain was still ours, exactly as we'd planned it. Tom stayed another few days before heading home, telling me, as he loaded his truck, that he was proud of how I'd handled it, disciplined instead of desperate, patient instead of reckless. The exact qualities that had once made me good at a job neither of us talked about much anymore. Denise called midweek to say she'd resigned from the HOA newsletter entirely, unwilling to keep serving under a board still deciding Karen's fate, and that several other longtime volunteers were doing the same. A quiet exodus that left the association's leadership thinner and considerably more cautious than before. Jenna's next article ran with new information from an anonymous board source. Karen had personally arranged the fabricated easement through a researcher who turned out to be
Rick Coulter's assistant. Paid in cash. A detail that finally, definitively, connected Karen's actions directly to the resort deal rather than mere overzealous volunteering.
The board scheduled a formal vote on Karen's removal as president for the following Saturday, and I received, unexpectedly, a call from the board's interim chair, a soft-spoken woman named Patricia Ruiz, asking, almost nervously, whether I'd be willing to attend and speak, if only briefly, about what had happened. I agreed, not out of any need to see Karen publicly humbled further, but because Patricia mentioned the board wanted to draft, formally and permanently, written acknowledgement of my parcel's grandfathered status. Something Priscilla had been requesting for months without ever quite getting the association to commit it to paper. The days before that vote passed quietly, the ridge cooling into early September. My cabin finally, truly finished after 10 years. Porch railing sanded. Solar array humming steadily. The last piece of unfinished business now sitting not in wood or wiring, but in a folding chair inside a clubhouse meeting room. I spent one evening going through Daniel's old letters, the ones he'd sent before he died, full of plans for this exact porch, this exact view, and understood, reading them again after everything, that finishing the cabin had never really been the hard part. Defending it, turned out, had been the true test. Saturday morning arrived clear and cold, the first real hint of fall settling over the ridge, and I drove down to the clubhouse one final time, Ranger waiting patiently in the truck, ready to say, plainly and without theatrics, exactly what the last year had cost, and exactly what it had proven. The clubhouse was packed tighter than I'd ever seen it. Folding chairs pulled from storage to line the back wall. Residents standing in the doorway when the seats ran out. Word of the vote having spread through every corner of the subdivision by Friday night. Karen arrived late. Paul beside her for the first time in weeks. Both of them moving through the crowd in a silence that felt heavier than any of her past confident entrances. No clipboard this time. No laminated map. Just a folder held tightly against her chest like a shield that no longer worked. Patricia Ruiz opened the meeting briskly, reading the formal agenda item aloud. A vote on the removal of Karen Ashford as HOA president, citing the county hearing's findings, the fabricated easement, the fraudulent lien, and violation of board bylaws requiring good faith representation of the association's interests. Karen requested to speak before the vote, and Patricia allowed it, though the room's silence as Karen stood felt nothing like the sympathetic hush of past meetings. Felt, instead, like an audience simply waiting, patiently, to hear whatever explanation she still believed might change what everyone already understood. I did what I thought was best for this community, Karen began, voice tight but steady. Property values, standards, protecting what we built here together. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Not agreement, but disbelief. Several residents shaking their heads at a framing that no longer matched anything they'd witnessed firsthand. A longtime resident named Carol Whitmore stood without being called on, something clearly rare for the normally reserved woman, and asked bluntly whether protecting The community had included forging a mining document and threatening a widowed veteran's homestead to help a developer she was financially tied to through her husband. Karen's composure slipped visibly at the word veteran, and I watched something flicker across her face. Not quite recognition, but close to it, as though some detail about who I actually was had only just, belatedly, landed with real weight after a year of treating me as simply an obstacle. "I didn't know," she started, then stopped herself, perhaps realizing how little that excuse would matter now. Regardless of what she had or hadn't known about my service record, when she first sent that laminated map to my mailbox with a smile that never reached her eyes. Paul spoke up then, unexpectedly, standing beside his wife, voice unsteady. "We're behind on the mortgage," he said quietly, the words landing hard in the packed room. "Rick offered to buy out our position in the LLC if the deal went through." Karen thought it was our only way out. The room went very still. It wasn't the confession of a scheming villain reveling in cruelty. It was the confession of two frightened, financially desperate people who had convinced themselves, gradually, that bending rules and forging paperwork was a reasonable price for saving the life they'd built. At my expense. I felt something complicated in that moment. Not forgiveness exactly. The fear tactics and forged documents had been real, and real fear had come with them, but not the pure vindictive satisfaction I might once have expected either. Mostly, I felt tired and ready, finally, for this particular fight to end. Patricia called for the vote after allowing a few more comments, and the tally came back overwhelming. 38 in favor of removal, 3 opposed, 2 abstentions. A landslide that left no ambiguity about where the community had ultimately landed once given the full, documented truth of the past year. Karen didn't argue the result. She simply nodded once, gathered her folder, and sat down heavily beside Paul. The fight visibly gone out of her posture entirely, replaced by something smaller, more exhausted, the look of someone who had run out of moves long before she'd run out of desperation. Patricia then turned to me, as promised, asking if I wanted to say anything before the meeting moved to new business. I stood, Ranger's leash still looped over my wrist from the truck, and kept it brief, the way Tom had always taught me to when the moment called for restraint rather than speeches. "I never wanted this fight," I said. "I wanted to build a home and be left alone on land that was always legally mine. I hope whatever comes next for this community means nobody else has to spend a year proving something that should have been obvious from the very first letter." I asked only one thing formally, that the board draft written, permanent acknowledgement of my parcel's grandfathered status, filed with the county, so no future president could ever again mistake my land for something within their authority. Patricia agreed on the spot, several board members nodding along without hesitation. As I sat back down, Denise, seated a few rows back, caught my eye and mouthed a quiet thank you, and Frank gave me a small thumbs up from across the aisle, small gestures that meant more than any applause could have, evidence that the truth, slow as it had been, had finally landed clearly. Patricia moved the meeting to new business, announcing that interim leadership would be handled by the board's vice president, a mild-mannered retired teacher named Walter Nunez, until a formal election could be scheduled, and that an independent review of HOA finances would begin immediately given recent concerns about board conduct. That last phrase caught my attention, and Frank later filled me in. Rumors had already begun circulating, quietly, that HOA reserve funds hadn't quite matched budget. Reports for the past 2 years. Discrepancies nobody had thought to question closely, while Karen's confident authority discouraged anyone from looking too hard. Karen and Paul left before the meeting fully adjourned. slipping out a side door while Patricia was still fielding questions about the financial review. And I noticed, watching them go, that nobody moved to stop them or say anything further, the room's attention already shifting toward whatever came next. Over the following week, the promised financial review confirmed what Frank's rumors had suggested. Nearly $6,000 in HOA landscaping and maintenance funds routed. Over 18 months. 2 invoices from a company later traced back to one of Rick Coulter's shell entities. Funds Karen had personally approved without board sign-off. Priscilla told me that discovery alone likely exposed Karen to embezzlement charges separate from anything related to my parcel dispute entirely. A consequence that had nothing to do with my land at all. Simply the natural unraveling of a pattern of control finally examined closely enough by people no longer inclined to look away. Jenna's article covering the removal vote and the emerging financial irregularities ran with a headline that made me laugh quietly the first time I read it. The HOA president who forgot whose land she was standing on.
It spread further than any of her previous pieces. Picked up by 2 statewide outlets.
Rick Coulter's development firm issued a formal statement withdrawing entirely from any further resort planning near Pine Hollow Ridge, citing changed circumstances. Language Priscilla called corporate for we got caught, though the state licensing board's inquiry into his LLC continued regardless of the firm's public retreat from the project. Gordon Fields, already having resigned as HOA counsel weeks earlier, issued his own brief statement distancing himself from any prior representation related to the Ridge parcel matter. A lawyer's careful way, Priscilla noted dryly, of trying to stand as far from the wreckage as professionally possible. I received, unexpectedly, a formal letter from the county the following week, not related to the HOA directly, but a commendation requested by Commissioner Alvarez, recognizing my diligence and integrity in defending a lawful property claim. A small gesture that meant more to me than I expected it to. Reading it alone on my porch. Mike Alvarez called personally to deliver the news himself, and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he'd looked into my service record after the hearing, out of simple curiosity about the calm, methodical way I'd handled myself. He didn't say more than that. He didn't need to. What he meant. Denise stopped by that weekend, hesitant at first, bringing a small jar of homemade jam as an awkward peace offering. We sat on the porch a long while, mostly quiet, Ranger's head resting between us, and she told me she was thinking of moving away from the subdivision entirely once her lease allowed it. I told her she didn't owe me anything further, that speaking up when she finally did had mattered more than any apology could, and that I hoped wherever she landed next came with fewer clipboards and laminated maps than the life she'd been living under Karen's shadow for longer than she'd admitted aloud. Frank organized a small, informal gathering the following Sunday, calling it, half joking, the first honest potluck this neighborhood's had in years, and I attended, Ranger in tow, sitting on Frank's back deck watching the ridge glow orange, surrounded by neighbors who, for the first time, simply treated me as one of their own. Karen's name came up only once that evening. Briefly, Carol Whitmore mentioning that she and Paul had listed their house for sale. Quietly, no public statement, no defiant final post to the neighborhood group. Just a realtor sign staked into their front lawn, and a for sale listing that spoke louder than anything else could have. 2 weeks later, the State Real Estate Licensing Board's inquiry into Rick Coulter's LLC concluded, finding sufficient evidence of fraudulent lien filing and forged documentation to refer the matter for formal disciplinary action, alongside a separate criminal referral to the district attorney's office regarding the fabricated mining easement. Karen was charged that October with 2 counts of filing false documents and 1 count of misuse of association funds. charges that carried the real possibility of fines and, depending on how the case unfolded, potential jail time, a consequence that landed hard even on neighbors who'd stopped defending her months earlier. Rick Coulter faced his own charges separately, tied to the fraudulent lien and the falsified easement, alongside the ongoing licensing board disciplinary proceedings that effectively ended his development career in the county entirely. His firm's name quietly scrubbed from every remaining permit application still pending anywhere in the region. Paul wasn't charged, having played no direct role in the forged documents themselves, though the couple's financial troubles, laid bare through the court proceedings, painted a fuller picture than anyone in the neighborhood had understood. Refinancing debt, a failed prior investment, and a marriage strained long before the Ridge Project ever began. I attended none of the criminal proceedings personally, choosing instead to let Priscilla monitor developments on my behalf, content that the county's own systems, however slowly, were finally handling what had started, absurdly, as a dispute over roof shingles on land that was never within anyone's jurisdiction but my own. The board finalized my written jurisdictional exemption that same month, filed permanently with the county recorder, language drafted by Priscilla herself specifying, in unambiguous terms, that my parcel and any future grandfathered properties like it remained entirely outside HOA authority regardless of any future covenant amendments the association might attempt. Walter Nunez, now serving as interim president, called me personally to apologize on behalf of the association, an unprompted gesture that surprised me, and asked, genuinely, what the neighborhood could do to rebuild trust with residents who'd watched Karen's authority go unchecked for far longer than it should have been allowed to. I told him honestly that trust wasn't something I needed from an association I'd never belonged to, but that transparency, real transparency, in how the board handled future disputes with any resident, member or not, would matter more than any gesture aimed specifically at repairing things with me alone. Jenna's reporting on the case earned her a regional journalism award that November, and she called me, laughing, saying half her acceptance speech would probably end up being about a stubborn aunt who kept a folder labeled Pine Hollow 3 inches thick before anyone else understood how serious this had actually become. I told her I was proud of her, genuinely, watching my niece grow into exactly the kind of careful, persistent reporter this whole ordeal had needed from the very beginning. Someone willing to follow a paper trail wherever it actually led rather than wherever the loudest voice in the room insisted it should go. Denise moved out of Pine Hollow Ridge Estates that winter, taking a small apartment in town closer to her daughter's school, and we kept in touch loosely. Occasional coffee when she visited the area. A friendship built, unexpectedly, from the wreckage of something that had never needed to happen in the first place. Karen's sentencing came in early spring, a combination of fines, restitution to the HOA for the misused funds, and a suspended sentence contingent on probation, a resolution Priscilla called about as fair as these things usually get. Neither the cruelty some neighbors had hoped for nor the impunity Karen had once assumed. I heard, secondhand through Frank, that Karen and Paul relocated out of state entirely after the house sold. A fresh start somewhere without a ridge, without an HOA newsletter, without a laminated map of a boundary that had never existed anywhere except in her own increasingly desperate imagination. I felt, hearing that, less satisfaction than I expected to, mostly just a quiet sense of closure, the particular relief of watching a long, exhausting chapter finally shut for good, replaced by nothing more dramatic than the ordinary, hard-won piece of simply being left alone on land that had always been mine. Rick Coulter's disciplinary proceedings concluded that same spring, his real estate license suspended for 3 years, His firm's remaining projects in the county quietly transferred to other developers. A quiet professional collapse that Priscilla noted, with some satisfaction, tended to follow men who mistook confidence for actual legal standing. The new HOA board, under Walter's steady leadership, revised the association's bylaws that summer, adding explicit language requiring documented verification for any claimed jurisdictional boundary changes. A direct response, Walter told me, to making sure nothing like the Ashford situation could ever happen to anyone else up here again. I was asked, and agreed, to review that revised language personally before it went to a final vote. A strange, quiet kind of vindication, sitting at Walter's kitchen table pointing out exactly which safeguards might have prevented an entire year of forged documents and fraudulent liens, had they existed sooner. Frank and I grew genuinely close that year, sharing firewood, trading garden vegetables, his teenage son occasionally helping me split logs in exchange for stories about the cabin's construction. Small, ordinary neighborly things that Karen's year of chaos had somehow made feel more valuable than they might have otherwise. Mike Alvarez stopped by once that autumn, unofficially, just to see the cabin he'd heard so much about during the hearing, and stood quietly at the porch railing for a long moment, looking out over the ridge, before saying simply, "Daniel would have loved this view." I told him he would have. I finished the last small project that fall. A modest wooden sign at the base of my driveway reading only Whitfield, private property. Established 1978. A quiet, permanent answer to every laminated map, every fabricated resolution, every letter that had ever tried to claim authority over ground that was never anyone's but mine. Winter came early that year, snow settling over the ridge in soft, heavy drifts, and I sat by the wood stove Karen had once tried to force me to replace. Ranger curled by the fire, the cabin finally, completely finished. 10 years and one exhausting fight later, exactly as Daniel and I had once imagined it. By the following spring, Pine Hollow Ridge Estates felt like a genuinely different place. Walter's board handling disputes with careful documentation instead of laminated confidence. The neighborhood group returning to mundane posts about lost cats and yard sales instead of veiled accusations aimed at whoever didn't fall in line. Denise and I met for coffee that April, and she told me she'd started volunteering at a local legal aid clinic. Something about the whole ordeal having shown her how much a little documentation and a willingness to speak up could actually change, even against someone who seemed, for a while, unstoppable. Jenna visited that summer. Notebook left at home for once. Just family. And we hiked up to the ridge's highest point together. Ranger bounding ahead. And she told me she was considering a book proposal about the whole saga. Small-town corruption and a woman who simply refused to be moved. I told her she could write whatever she wanted, so long as she remembered the story was never really about me winning against Karen specifically, but about what happens when ordinary documentation, patience, and a refusal to panic outlast even the most confident, well-connected campaign of intimidation eventually thrown against it. Frank's garden and mine merged into an informal shared plot that year. Tomatoes and beans climbing along a fence line that had once been the exact spot. Survey stakes were illegally driven into my tree line. A small, quiet reclamation that felt more satisfying than any courtroom verdict ever fully could. Autumn returned again. 2 full years now since that first laminated map appeared at the mailbox cluster. And I sat on my finished porch one evening, Ranger graying slightly at the muzzle, watching the sun drop behind the ridge in exactly the colors Daniel and I had once pictured from a rental cabin years before any of this began. I thought, as I often did in these quiet moments, That home was never something anyone could simply hand you or take from you with a clipboard and a confident smile. It was something built, log by log, year by year, and defended, patiently, with nothing more dramatic than the truth kept carefully on file. The wooden sign at the base of my driveway still stands exactly where I placed it, weathered now but legible, and every so often a new resident driving past will ask a neighbor about the cabin lady up the ridge, and the story they hear back always ends the same simple way. She never once had to raise her voice, because the truth, eventually, always does.